Hey everyone, and welcome to the final episode in my beginner series on how to build within Horizon Worlds. This episode is going to cover scripting, which is effectively its own visual programming language inside of Worlds. If you've come from an app like Unity or Unreal Engine and used their visual Bolt or Blueprint systems, this is going to feel very familiar. But for me, who did not come from a background of programming or game development, it was a real challenge to get into even the basics of how to hook up a script in Horizon Worlds. So this video is going to do exactly that. I will show you the basic UI and ways that you can attach scripts to objects, how you can connect objects to each other, and then I'm going to go over a few basic programming principles that should help you build tons of scripts in Horizon Worlds. Namely, if statements, loops, variables, and a lot more. So thank you for watching, and let's get started. I've started a new world here to make sure that we're as clutter-free as possible. I'm going to open my build menu, go to my gizmos, and drag out this script gizmo here. When I open the properties panel of my script, I'm presented with this UI. Let's take a second to go over what we're seeing here, just to ground ourselves before we actually start scripting. This large, mostly blank space here is where you will build your scripts. To build scripts, you simply drag and drop these code blocks that you see over here on the right into your main scripting panel here. As you can see, there are 6 different tabs that organize these code blocks into various groups. The first tab here is called Events, and these are all of the ways that a script can be activated. Think of these as when event X happens, do Y. You'll find events here for all sorts of things. As you can see, when world is started is the default option that is populated in my main scripting window here. But there's also events here for player and object collisions, custom event triggers, and a lot more. The next 2 tabs are the things that can be triggered from an event. This tab here is the Motion tab, and this contains all of the different ways that you can make an object or a player move using a script. The third tab is the Actions tab, and these are all of the things that a script is capable of affecting within your world. In this tab, you can find code blocks to activate sounds and music, trigger visual effects, start and stop animations, and a lot more. The next 2 tabs here, Operators and Values, are a bit more complex, but they're effectively ways to program logic for things like tracking hit points for a shooter game, scores for a sports game, and so on. We'll cover some of this later in the video. Lastly is the Variables tab, and this is simply a place where you can create your own custom things to track and modify. Again, we'll cover that later in the video. So to see how scripts work in Horizon Worlds and go through the basic workflow, let's start by doing something really simple. We're going to make an object rotate continuously. Not only that, but we'll learn how to activate this script both automatically and by having a player trigger that animation. This might not sound very exciting, but it's going to let us look at a few core concepts within scripting, namely loops and variables, both of which are incredibly powerful tools in Horizon Worlds scripting. Before I continue, I'll go to my scripts panel and stop my world so that the script isn't actively running whenever I make a change. If you don't do this, your object will start to move itself into strange orientations as I make changes, so it's easier to just stop the world for now and resume it when I'm ready to test my script. I'm going to drag out this cube from my personal asset library, which will serve as the object will rotate. I highly recommend making sure you have snapping turned on and that your cube is oriented with the Y positive axis facing directly upwards. We'll get into why that step is important shortly. Now I'll open up the properties panel for both my cube and my script. I mentioned this in a previous video, but it's worth mentioning again. You should always name your objects and your scripts as soon as you build them. There is no central place in Horizon Worlds to see a comprehensive list of objects and scripts, which means that it's very easy to get lost while scripting if you aren't careful about organizing as you go. So I've named my primitive cube1, and my script is labeled spin cont, so I know that this script will spin an object continuously. The simplest way to make a script run is by attaching it directly to the object that you want the script to affect. To do that, look at the very bottom of the Properties panel on this Cube 1 object. You'll see a section here for Attached Script. If I select the drop-down menu here, you'll see a list of every script that is currently placed within my world. In this case, there's only one, Spin Cont, so I'll choose that. Once I select my Spin Cont script, it is now attached to this object and I'm ready to create my script. This is a good time to mention the logic that you should think about every time you make a script. In Horizon Worlds, you must always think about two major categories. What is the thing that makes my script activate? And once it's activated, what do I want my script to do? If I look at my scripting panel, you can see the When World is Started event here, which tells this script to activate as soon as a player first enters the world. So for this script, when do I want it to activate? Well, I do want this script to activate as soon as a player enters the world, so I can leave this event code block as is. Once it's activated though, what do I want my script to do? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I want to make this cube rotate continuously. So as you might have guessed, in order to make my cube rotate, I want to navigate here to the Motion tab. In this situation, I'll be using the Motion Over Time section of code blocks here. This moves your object like instant motion does here at the top, but the difference is that the Motion Over Time code blocks include a time value in the code block that will let us tell the script how long we want something to take while it moves to a new position. Additionally, you're going to see these Move To and Move By code blocks, in addition to Rotate and Scale. In short, the Move To code blocks will move an object to a specific location within your world grid. Move By, on the other hand, will move an object relative to the current position of that object that is moving. In this situation, I want my object to stay where I've placed it within my world and simply rotate in place. So I'm going to grab this Rotate By Over Time code block and drag it over to my When World is Started event and then nest it underneath that. So again, what makes this script activate? This event, When World is Started, is in my script, so it's activated as soon as a player first enters this world. And after it's triggered, what does my script do? Well, if I just read it from left to right, it rotates itself by this value over the course of 1 second. If I open my build menu and go to the scripts tab, I can hit the play button here to restart the world, and we can see that my script behaves as intended. It rotates by 90 degrees over 1 second and then stops. You can hit this reset button to restart your world, which will replay the animation. Before we move on, let's take a closer look at this Rotate By code block and go over each component. The self pill that you see here refers to whichever object you've attached your script to. In this case, that object is my cube, but I can attach this script to any object that I want, and self will always refer to the object that the script is attached to. The next pill here is your rotation vector, which contains 3 values, 90, 0, and 0. These values are, in order, your X, Y, and Z axes. So this will rotate the X axis by 90 degrees, but the Y and Z axes are set to 0, which means they don't rotate at all along those axes. Last is this number value, 1, which refers to the amount of seconds it takes for this animation to happen. While this script works, it still doesn't do exactly what I set out to do. All it does now is rotate by 90 degrees and then stops. I want my cube to rotate continuously along the Y-axis. So the first thing that I'll do is change the 90 value here in the X-axis to 0 and change the 0 value in my Y-axis to 90. And I'll just leave the Z-axis at 0. This is why I mentioned earlier that you should make sure your Y-positive axis is facing directly upwards. If my cube is rotated sideways and I reset the world, for example, you'll notice that even though I haven't changed the rotation vector values, my cube is now rotating in a different direction than where I had it previously. When you're scripting objects to animate, it's really helpful when the orientation of your objects is consistent. So I'll put my object back to its original position where the Y positive value is facing directly up in my world. Now when I reset my world, my cube rotates along the correct axis, but it still stops after moving 90 degrees over the course of 1 second. So to make this object rotate continuously, you'll need to set up a loop inside of your script. Loops in Horizon Worlds are done using 2 event code blocks: the send event and the when event is received code blocks. By sending an event back to itself repeatedly, we can make a simple looping script. I'll find the when event is received code block and drag it into my script. In the drop-down menu of this code block, you'll find a handful of pre-written events to choose from. These are all simply labels or strings for you programmers out there, and don't actually refer to any particular use case. So I could use any of them listed here if I wanted to, but I'll keep organized by selecting new event and creating one called rotation. Now I have a new event that will trigger whenever an event called rotation is received. But right now there isn't anything to send the rotation event to this script. In order to do that, I'll grab the send event with delay code block and drag it in. Then I can select my rotation event that I just created in the dropdown. I'll take my rotate over time code block from earlier and drag it down under this new event. Lastly, I'll drag out a send event code block without the delay and place it under my when world is started event. Okay, we just did a bunch of stuff, so let's stop and summarize what's happening here by going line by line. So at the top, as soon as the world is started, send an event called rotation to self. Remember from earlier, self simply refers to whichever object your script is attached to. And because I used the send event code block and not the send event with delay, this event will send the instant my world is started. The next line here is when event is received, which is set up to receive the rotation event I created, and that is being sent by this code block here. When that rotation event is received, the following things happen. It will rotate this object, and then it will send the rotation event back to self after 1 second. And because this send event with delay code block is contained within the when event is received event, this creates a simple loop where the event triggers itself automatically every 1 second. An important thing to note when a script is running is that the script will run all of the code blocks of a triggered event simultaneously. So both this rotate by over time and this send event with delay code block trigger at the exact same time. That's why we have the with delay code block here. If we didn't, this send event code block would trigger over and over rapidly, rather than waiting for the rotation to finish before looping. And while that technically would work in your script, you're effectively making this script run over and over constantly when it doesn't need to, which could cause performance issues. So it's best to only have a script run when it needs to. So now this script should work as intended, and if I hit play in my build menu, you can see that it works perfectly. So now we have a working script that rotates this cube continuously along the y-axis. And you now know how to attach a script to an object, and you can make that script do something. You can even set up a simple loop so that this script can activate itself over and over again. The next fundamental principle of scripting that we're going to go over is variables. As I mentioned earlier, variables are a way to track and modify things inside of a script, but they're also how you can have a script refer to something outside of the object the script is attached to. Say for example that rather than having one cube that I want to rotate, I have 3 cubes. Well, I can attach this exact same script to all 3 cubes and they'll do exactly that. But what if I want them all to rotate at different speeds? So let's set this script up in a way where I can adjust the speed of my spin on a per object basis. To do this, I'll navigate to the Variables tab and create a new variable. The first thing that you need to do to create a variable is to select the variable type. That might be a rotation or a position vector or even an object. You can see all of the options here in this list. In this case though, the amount of time that it takes for my object to rotate is represented by a single number. So I'll make sure that my new variable is a number in this drop-down menu, and because this value is going to represent time, I'll label it spin time. Once I click confirm, you'll see your new number variable listed here. Right now, the default value is set to 0, so I'll change that to match my original number of 1. Now I can grab this variable and drop it into the numerical value of my code block here. As you can see, this pill has now been replaced by my new variable value. I also know that for the loop that I set up earlier, I always want the amount of time it takes for my object to rotate to match the amount of time it takes for my script to loop. So I'll put the same variable into the delay of my send event code block. This way, I only need to change a single number for both my rotation over time code block and my send event code block to be updated. The other huge advantage to this variable is that if I come over to the properties panel of my 3 cube objects, you can see that my spin time variable is now listed here below my attached script, along with a value that I'm able to change. This value currently shows the number I entered inside of my script gizmo, but if I change the value here in the properties panel of this cube, it will only affect this specific object, not the original script. So if I enter the value of 2 here, you can see that my other 2 objects will still maintain the value of 1. I can then change my third object to 0.2 and then hit play on my world. Now you can see that even though I'm using the exact same script, I'm able to customize the time value on a per object basis. This means no wasted time creating multiple scripts for each rotation speed that I want, which saves you both the time needed to create multiple scripts and the capacity that those scripts take up within your world. As a quick tip, you can even set up a new rotation variable and replace the original rotation pill in my rotate by code block. That way, if for some reason I didn't set my Y positive axis on an object to point straight up, I can still adjust the direction of my rotation quickly here in the properties panel, rather than having to dive back into the script. Another thing that variables are good for is letting you affect objects other than the one that you have your script attached to. To show an example of this, let's set up a simple script where a player steps onto a pad and then my cubes start to rotate, rather than those cubes rotating as soon as the world begins. I'll create a cube here and place it on the ground, which will act as the visual representation of a pad for a player to step on. Then I'll come into my gizmos panel and drag a trigger gizmo into the world. A trigger is an object that can detect a collision, either from a player or another object, which can then activate a script via an event. Note that the triggers, just like most gizmos, are invisible to players and can only be seen while in build mode. An important thing to note is that for a trigger to work, you must attach a script directly to the trigger gizmo, which means that my original script that was intended to be attached directly to my spinning cubes isn't very useful anymore. So rather than editing this script, I'll grab a new script gizmo and name it Cube Rotation Trigger. And again, I need to ask myself, when do I want my script to activate, and what should I do once it does? Well, to answer the first question, I want to have this script activate whenever a player enters this trigger. So I'll scroll down and grab this when trigger is entered by player event code block and drag it into my script panel. I don't need this when world is started event anymore, so I can delete that. I'll then repeat what I did in my previous script to set up a simple loop. I'll grab the send event, when event is received, and send event with delay code block, and then set them up in a loop like I did before. I'll then go to the motion tab, bring in the rotate by over time code block, and once again make sure that I rotate along the y-axis. Now we have a script that's nearly identical to my previous script, with one major exception. Instead of activating when a player enters the world, it activates when a player enters this trigger. But as you may have noticed, we have a problem. The code block still says to rotate self, and since I'm attaching my script directly to the trigger and not to my spinning cube, right now there's nothing in this script that lets me point to this cube as the object that should be spinning. So for a script to move an object that it isn't directly attached to, we'll need to create an object variable. I'll make a new one and call it cube1 and drag it over to replace the self pill here. So instead of rotating the trigger itself, this script now wants to rotate an object called cube1. But currently my script doesn't automatically know what cube1 is referring to. So how do you connect an object variable within a script to an actual object in your world? Well, first I need to attach the script that I just made to my trigger gizmo. Once I do, you're going to see a new cube1 variable listed here. Now, you want to make sure that you have the properties panel of my trigger open, as well as the properties panel of my cube object that I want to spin. In the properties panel of my cube, right above where you would normally attach a script, you'll see a blue pill with the same name as the object itself. I can then pick up this pill, come over to the variable listed in my trigger object, and release it in this blank field here. Once you do, the name of your cube object will now be listed here, showing that you have successfully told this script that your cube1 variable is referring to this object here. You'll also notice a line that connects this variable to the object itself, so by following that line, you can see exactly which object you have attached. This script should now work as intended. I'll go into preview mode and walk over to my new floor pad, and as soon as I step on it, the trigger should see that the player has collided with it, which will signal for my cube to start spinning. Fantastic. You now know how to point object variables at specific objects, which means that you can have scripts that refer to as many other objects as you need for whatever you're building, and you can leverage that to enable the use of the trigger gizmo. There's one more method of triggering scripts that is super useful. This is a way to have a specific object in your world activate a trigger rather than a player. In this example, I have a red and a blue ball and a simple bucket here to place them in. I want the blue ball to make my cube spin, but not the red ball. To do this, I can use the exact same script as before with one exception. I simply need to set up my triggering event to be when trigger is entered by object rather than when trigger is entered by player. That's all you need to do for the script, but you still need to tell the trigger which objects it should detect collisions for. To do that, I'll open the properties panel of both my trigger gizmo and my blue ball. On both of these, I want to make sure that I apply identical tags to each. So I'll type in blue in both places. It doesn't matter which word you use, they just need to match each other exactly. Now when I drop the red ball into the bucket, nothing happens because I didn't apply an object tag to the red ball. But if I put in the blue one that does contain my object tag, the cube starts spinning. There are a ton of ways you can leverage object tagging, like having to place a specific item in a specific orientation for a puzzle mechanic, or even by leveraging the Raycast Gizmo, which we'll get into later in the video. Now let's go over another example of how to script in Horizon Worlds, but this time we need to contend with one major issue that you're going to run into whenever you're scripting almost anything in Horizon Worlds: the players. Whenever you're scripting anything, it's very important that you build scripts that are robust enough to withstand players who perform actions that you might not expect. This is an important step for developing any product or game, not just Horizon Worlds, but I think it's worth talking through how I think about this when I script something in Worlds. So let's stick with a simple movement script like we have been, but this time we're going to make a door that opens when a player approaches and closes when a player steps away from it. In order to have a script know whether a player is close to my door or not, I'll know that I need a trigger gizmo, so I'll grab one of those. I'll then scale up this trigger so that it's the size that I want my detection radius to be. Before I dive into my script, an important thing to know about Horizon Worlds is that when you script movement or rotation in an object, that object moves and rotates from the center of your object, not the edge. Because I want my door to rotate from the edge of the door frame here and not from the center of the door, I'll need to double the width of my door by adding a second invisible object. So I'll create a new object, and then I'll snap it to the side of the door that I want it to swing from, and then jump into the properties panel and turn off both collision and visibility for this object. Lastly, I'll group the door and this new invisible object together and call it Door 1. I'm now ready to write my script, so I'll grab a script gizmo and open it up. First things first, I know that I want my object to rotate when a player enters this trigger and close when a player leaves the trigger. So I'll scroll down to the Events tab here until I find when trigger is entered by player and when trigger is exited by player. Then I simply need to go to the Motion tab and grab the Rotate By Over Time code block and drop it under my When Trigger is Entered event. I know that I want my door to rotate by 90 degrees, so I'll type -90 here in the Properties panel of my rotation vector, making sure to once again use the Y-axis. I also know that I'll need to attach this script to my trigger and not my door, so I need to swap out the self pill here for a new object variable for my door. I'll go to my variables and do just that, making sure to name it the same thing as my door object, and then drag it in here to replace the self pill. Lastly, I'll grab this rotation code block, drag it down to the When Trigger is Exited event, and tap the Duplicate button to make a copy of that code block. To reverse the direction, I'll just remove that minus here in front of the y-axis value to say that it should move by 90 degrees in the opposite direction instead of moving forward by another 90 degrees. Now if I go to preview mode and step close to the door, it opens, and if I move away, it closes. This is great, but there is one major problem with this. It's easily possible to break this animation by rapidly moving in and out of the trigger. This is happening because the rotation animation I scripted lasts 1 second, but it's possible for a player to move in and out of this trigger zone faster than 1 second. I can decrease the amount of time that this animation takes to help mitigate the issue, but that won't completely solve the problem, especially if I have multiple players in the world who can all potentially trigger this door animation. So how do we fix this problem so that the door never breaks and won't swing beyond its intended range of 90 degrees? Well, the first step towards solving this is to somehow communicate to the script about the current state of the door and only move the door back and forth between open and closed. There's a few different ways to do this, but here I'm going to use a Boolean to solve the issue. A Boolean is simply a variable that can be in one of two states, true or false. So I'll make a new Boolean variable and call it door state. You can decide what makes the most sense for you in your own scripts, but for me, I want false to mean that the door is closed and true to mean that the door is open. And because my door's default state is closed, I'll want to leave this Boolean set to false. Now, to make this work properly, we need to look at another fundamental concept within any programming language, if statements. These essentially tell your scripts to work if a particular thing is true. So I'll go to my Events tab, and at the very top, you're going to see if as one of the options. I'll drag that into my script right below my when trigger is entered event. Note that for all of these green events here at the top, they must be nested below another event, like when trigger is entered. They can't exist on their own. Once I drop this into my script, you'll see a blank spot that says condition. This is where I need to tell my if statement what to look out for. In this case, I want my door to open only if the door is already closed. So I'm going to jump here to my Operators tab and look at the very top section. These contain code blocks that let me build logic into my scripts and say things like if something is equal to, if something is not equal to, if it's greater than or equal to, and so on. I want my code block to say if my Boolean is false, meaning that the door is closed, then open the door. So I'll take this double equal symbol, which simply means is equal to, and drag it over to the empty condition box on my if statement. Now you'll see two empty values, meaning that our if statement code block now says if A equals B. Now I can come to my Variables tab and drag in my Boolean to the first empty slot. Then I'll go back to my Values tab and scroll down until I find Boolean input and drag that into the second slot, making sure that it is set to false. This statement now reads, if my door state Boolean is false, do stuff. That stuff is already down here from earlier, so I'll just drag up the rotation code block and nest it here under my if statement. Now I have a script that will open the door when a player steps inside of a trigger if my Boolean is false, aka closed. But even though the animation itself will work now and the door will open if I walk into the trigger, I still need to change my Boolean variable to true, indicating to the script that my door is now open. I do that by going back to my Values tab and grabbing the set2 code block and then dragging it in under my if statement. Now I can grab my door state Boolean as well as this Boolean value. Remember to tap the duplicate button when moving code block pills this way, otherwise it's simply going to move those variables rather than creating copies of them. I'll then flip that Boolean value here to true, so now we have a code block that says set my door state Boolean to true. We now have a door script that does the following. When trigger is entered by player, open the door if my Boolean is set to false. And when that happens, also set my Boolean to true, indicating that my door is now open. The next step is to simply grab the entire if statement and duplicate it below where my when trigger is exited event is. Then I'll simply flip the values. So my top Boolean value gets set to true, the direction of my rotation is 90 instead of minus 90, and the Boolean is set to false instead of true once this event is triggered. Lastly, I'll just make sure that none of my old code blocks from the original script are still hanging out down here below and interfering. Now let's jump back into preview mode and test this out. If I step into my trigger zone, I can see that the door opens, and when I leave, it closes. Now if I move in and out rapidly, dang, I still have the exact same issue. The door manages to swing further than intended and still gets messed up. Fortunately, the reason why is pretty simple. I simply need to tell my trigger only to detect player collisions once my door is fully open or fully closed, and not to detect collisions when my door is mid-animation. So to do this, I'll navigate to my Actions tab and find the Set Trigger Detection code block. I'll drag this in under my first if statement and just make sure that it sets itself to false. So now my trigger will stop detecting player collisions once it has been activated. But since I want my door to also close when a player leaves the trigger, I need to reactivate that trigger's ability to detect collisions after my door animation has finished. So I'll go to my Events tab and drag in a Send Event with Delay code block and make a new event called Door Trigger. I know I want this delay to happen at the same rate that my door animation happens. So, like we did before, I'm going to go make a new number variable and call it Swing Time. Not only can I now easily adjust the speed that my door swings in the properties panel of my trigger, but the trigger collision detection will always re-enable at the same speed as my door swing animation. Now I just need to add a when event is received event to my script and make sure that I select my door trigger event. I can then duplicate this set trigger detection code block from above and flip it to true. Last but not least, I need to duplicate both the trigger detection and the send event with delay code blocks into my second if statement, so that my logic applies whenever my door is open or closed. I should now have a script that will open if my door is closed, close if it's open, and if it's in some in-between state, it shouldn't do anything. If I jump into preview mode and test it out, it's finally working. And even if I jump in and out of my trigger zone rapidly, my door won't start to swing through the door frame and end up in odd orientations. And you know what? Just because we've already gone to so much effort to make this door great, let's add some quick sound effects to really make it perfect. That's as simple as making two new object variables, one for the sound of my door opening and another for the sound of it closing. Then under my Actions tab, I'll scroll down and grab the Play Sound code block and put one under each of my if statements. I'll drop in my variables and then dive into my build menu, go to sounds and type in door. I'll find two good sounds to use for this door. Note that a sound's position will always match the location of these sound gizmos. So I'll drag both of these sounds and place them right next to my door so it sounds like the sounds are coming from my door. Then I just need to open up the properties panel of my trigger and both of these sound objects and then link up both of my sounds to their proper values. Back in preview mode, we can see that we have a fully functional door that makes sounds as it opens and closes. Congratulations, you are now armed with a ton of fundamental knowledge that you need to make a plethora of different scripts. You can even jump into the asset library in your build menu, and if you navigate to the Interactables tab on the left, you can see several game mechanics and objects that include scripts. If you grab any one of these and open it up, you can see how these scripts are put together and reverse engineer how they work so that you're able to reconfigure them for your own use. Now, if you remember from my previous lesson, there's a couple different gizmos in Horizon Worlds that we didn't cover in my last video because they required the use of scripting. So let's go over those quickly right now. Quests and leaderboards are both simple to use. If I drag those gizmos into the world, you'll see that they're actually just UI panels that display information for the player. The trick to both of them is to jump into your build menu and navigate to the systems panel at the bottom. At the left, make a new quest and call it whatever you want. Then I'll grab a new script and a new trigger and I'll set them up to detect player collisions as my event. Near the bottom of my Actions tab, I'll find the Set Achievement code block, which is actually referring to quests. Once I drag that in, I can set the quest I created earlier from the dropdown and populate the pill here with a player. Now if I step onto this trigger inside of preview mode, the quest will complete. Remember that you can have this quest trigger from anything in your Events tab on the script gizmo, including the if statements at the top. So you can have quest complete for finding an object, hitting a specific score in a game, and a lot more. Quests can encourage players to explore deeper into a world than they might otherwise, so see if you can come up with quests for all of your worlds to help drive up player engagement. Leaderboards work in a very similar way. I simply go to my systems panel and create a new leaderboard. The main difference here is that while there is only one quests panel, you can have multiple leaderboards that track various player activities. So I could have one leaderboard for a high score, for example, and another one that tracks the fastest player, or any number of things. Just make sure that you jump into the properties panel of your leaderboard gizmo and select which category that you want that particular leaderboard to display for others. Then in your script, go to the Values tab and grab the Set Leaderboard Value code block. Populate the player pill and enter a value that you want to attribute to this particular leaderboard. I'll leave mine at 1 just for this demonstration purpose, but once again, remember that you can have these leaderboards trigger in a multitude of ways depending on what you want to be tracked. The great thing about both quests and leaderboards is that they're persistent, meaning that if a player leaves your world and comes back, their quests and leaderboards remain tracked. The next gizmo we need to talk about is the Projectile Launcher Gizmo, and this is a cool one. It does exactly what it sounds like, launches a projectile. The most common use of this is for a gun. So I'll drag a laser gun here out of the asset library and also grab a Projectile Launcher Gizmo. I, of course, want my projectiles to launch out of the barrel of my gun, so I'll line it up at the front here. Then I'll group the gun and the gizmo into the same object so that the projectile launcher always sticks with the gun. Then I just need to make a very simple script. First, in the case of a gun, I want it to shoot a bullet whenever I push the trigger. So I'll scroll down in the Events tab to Controller Events and drag in the When Trigger is Pressed event into my script, and then delete the When World is Started event. Then I need to go over to my Actions tab and scroll down until I find the Launch Projectile code block. I'll drag that in below my When Trigger is Pressed event. Lastly, I just need to create a new object variable and call it Bullet, and then drag it into my Launch Projectile code block. Then I can attach this script directly to my gun and then link up the projectile launcher to the object variable that I just created. And just to make sure this gun doesn't look weird when I grab it, I'll go into the Properties panel and find the Grab Anchor setting. Using this, I'm able to line up this little ghost hand to the handle of my gun. This makes sure that when a player picks up this weapon, it will always be held in the proper orientation. You can even check the per hand grab anchor box to make sure it works for all of the lefties out there. Now I have a simple gun that should shoot a bullet when I squeeze the trigger. Note that you can open the Properties panel of your projectile launcher and adjust the color, size, tail length, and several other properties. That way you can make your bullets look like lasers and customize it to your liking. You can even make them look like missiles. It's probably worth also attaching a sound to the script so that your weapon makes a noise when you fire a bullet. Just remember to keep the sound grouped with the gun so that the noise always emits from the correct location. The last gizmo we haven't discussed yet is the Raycast Gizmo. If I drag one out, you can see that there's this line that shoots off into the distance. This line can detect the collision of an object, trigger, or player. In the Properties panel, you can set the length, affecting how far away this gizmo can detect collisions. I can attach it here to the front of my gun, so now when I pick it up and move it around, there's this constant hit detection beam emanating from the barrel. So using this gizmo, let's make a simple script that plays a sound when I hit a target. I'll jump into a new script, and I need to make a new object variable that lets me assign my Raycast Gizmo. I'll also make another object variable that will act as my sound effect when I successfully hit my target. Something to note with the Raycast Gizmo is that it does not constantly detect collisions. You need to tell it when to track collision data. So to make this Raycast work, first I need to tell my script to fire off the Raycast Gizmo. At the very bottom of my Actions tab, I can find the Raycast code block and drag that in, and then apply my Raycast variable to that. Now this script will fire off this Raycast Gizmo whenever I pull the trigger. But right now this script does not do anything with that Raycast data, so we need to take that data from the Raycast and apply it to the script. Since I only want the sound to play if I hit the target, I'll go to my Events tab and bring in an if statement. Then at the bottom of my Operators tab here, you'll find Get Raycast Data. If I drag that into my if statement, you'll see a drop-down with several options. These are the various bits of data that you can pull from your Raycast Gizmo on demand. In this case, I'll go with the Did Hit Object option, which is going to let me use object tagging to determine whether or not I hit my target. I just need to use my same Raycast variable here and then drag in a play sound code block with my sound object variable applied to it. Now I just need to open the Properties panel of both my target and my Raycast, and then make sure that both are set to objects tagged, and then put in a matching keyword. Then, after linking up my sounds and other variables, I have a simple script that will play a sound whenever I hit a target. As you can probably imagine, I can use this same method to do things like detect the collision of a player or specific objects and make shooting games like Arena Clash or many others. You should now have the fundamental building blocks of how to build scripts within Horizon Worlds. And between this and the previous episodes, I hope you can now go out and build the world of your dreams. Now, I realize scripting is far more advanced than what I've covered in this video, so I highly recommend going to watch videos by Meta themselves, Video, Gosroth, and many others who have done great jobs on building content out there for scripting within Horizon Worlds. And once again, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them as quickly as possible. Thanks for watching, everyone, and happy building.